thank you for coming. It's always a very nice surprise to see a full house, full room here, and my gratitude to all of you for coming in. What I do really think is going to be quite a wonderful exchange of ideas here, not only between our panelists but between the audience and the panelists. I should apologize right at the beginning. I do this every time. We realize that the space has some limitations. The good thing is that you can't see me, and there's not much to see, though my colleagues are better looking than me. But the room is rather longitudinal. We are actually working on a new seminar room downstairs in the building, but that won't happen till the end of the semester. But meanwhile, this is a cozy atmosphere. We are amongst friends. And as always, we actually have a very, very interesting and pertinent audience for a very, very interesting and pertinent topic. A few things before we start in terms of more sort of housekeeping things. We have an exciting set of activities here at the Pardee Center for the study of the longer range future coming up for the semester. This is our first seminar of this semester. We have the next one on Thursday, October the 9th. You'll get emails on this, so I won't go into too much details, but that is on food security. And we have myself and Professor McCann from history, and we have a guest coming in for that, Hans Hoogeveen, who is the head of the Dutch Ministry for Food and Agriculture. And he will join us for that event on food security and food issues. On November the 3rd, which is a Monday, we have the next seminar after that, which is on technology and development. The panel isn't set, but one of our guests, and this is why it's on that date, is going to be the technology vice president for strategy and planning from BP, which used to be British Petroleum, is now beyond something. Beyond petroleum, but that should be interesting, and that panel is going to be on technology and development in general. He and two other of our colleagues from BU, and the last seminar of the semester will be December 2, which is a Monday, on the future of Latin America, led by Professor Kevin Gallagher, who's at International Relations and also a fellow here. Last thing, and a very important thing, we have in the last week of October, our distinguished lecturer and visiting Pardee professor visiting, which is Professor Simon Levin from Princeton. And all across the week, we'll have multiple events with him, two of which are of particular importance. Monday, the 27th of October, on the 9th floor of the management school, we have him speaking, giving his first distinguished lecture on a very interesting topic, which is cooperation and collective behavior from bacteria to the global commons, and looking at what the world can learn from bacteria, which I assume is a lot. And on Wednesday, he'll give his second lecture, which is on ecosystems as complex adaptive systems and the scientific challenges in achieving a sustainable future. On Tuesday and Thursday that week, this is the week of 27th, and this is the part that I really did want to announce, we will have a small luncheon with him on the Tuesday for faculty, on the Thursday for interested students who are working in that area. So if anyone is interested in joining in, we would be most honored, and please let me know or send us an email at the center and we'll do that. So sorry for that, but I thought I would lay out what we have planned for this semester, which is a fair amount. Coming to the panel at hand, we have a very interesting topic, as I said, which is looking at future challenges beyond the energy crisis. So we are all caught up in this daily sort of number game. You looked at the Dow numbers before, and now you try not to. And then you started looking at the oil pricing, and it kind of became this game. It was kind of interesting. You could talk to a cab driver, to at a dinner party, to just about anyone on what the daily oil price was. And at some point, one hopes that we will get out of this immediate crisis of oil that has captured all of our attention. But in that attention, we would have thought slightly more sensibly and maybe more systemically about the energy crisis. And what we want to do in this panel is to have our three panelists talk about what that might look like, what the path from here to there might look like, what there might look like, and what would it take to get from here to the there that is more desirable than where we are today. We have three panelists, Professor Cutler Cleveland, a longtime friend and mentor here at Boston University at the Geography and Environment Department, who's done an immense amount of work on energy issues in general. I won't even go through it, but the editor of the Encyclopedia of Energy, apart from other things. We have Professor Uday Pal, who is from the School of Engineering, has done a tremendous amount of some very groundbreaking work on fuel cells, and he will be talking about this. And third, and I must say I'm particularly proud of this, we have one of our graduate fellows, Moeed Yusuf, and we want to sort of encourage our fellows to participate in these things more and more. Moeed is a PhD doctoral student in political science, but he's here largely because he has just written, and we are about to publish, a paper on the future of nuclear energy. So the three of them will be speaking. One more little advertisement here. On your way back, you'll find a bunch of our publications by the staircase. Do please feel free to take some. We have some interesting things coming in. The event today is co-sponsored with the Frederick Pardee Center by the Center for Energy and Environmental Studies. We have Robert Kaufman from there. Thank you, Robert. We have, of course, Cutler Cleveland from there. It is also co-sponsored by an exciting initiative that is beginning at the university, which is the Clean Energy and Environmental Sustainability Initiative. And we have the Dean of Engineering, Professor Lucien, here, who I will ask to say just a few things about that initiative. We actually have a number of other interesting initiatives happening at the university around the whole environment and sustainability issues that I'll also ask Cutler to just say a few words about. But maybe, Ken, if I can have, I know you have to leave earlier, but if you can say just a few words. The camera is right there. The audience is right there. So speak to whoever you wish.
Thanks, Adil. So a few words about the Clean Energy and Environmental Sustainability Initiative. First of all, what better place to tell you about it than the Center for Long Range Future? I'm pretty sure that without energy or an environment, there'll be no future. So this is a perfect place to have kickoff. I want to thank you for organizing this, and I think the Pardee Center is a fantastic center that will complement what we're going to try to achieve with this initiative. And talk about energy. It took me more energy to walk over here than I think I have left to walk back. But I just want to tell you that this initiative is a joint effort between the College of Arts and Sciences, School of Management, and the College of Engineering. It recognizes that what BU can do in this space of the challenge of coming up with an energy solution that is environmentally friendly and economically sustainable is take advantage of what BU is, which is this multidimensional university that can bring to bear all the dimensions of this challenge to a solution, which is a very long-range challenge, no question about it. And so recognizing that, the faculty and the deans of all those colleges and the provost and the president and the VP for research have gotten together at various stages and various points and pushed forward to get groups of faculty together, and there's a steering committee. Many of the people are in this room on the steering committee, to try to put together an initiative which will eventually become a bigger, hopefully a bigger program in which these schools are working together for an integrated solutions to this problem, both from a research point of view and from an academic programmatic point of view, trying to create academic programs that introduce students to all the dimensions of the energy challenge, from technology to policy to environmental science to the economic problems and the systems solutions to those, combining all those issues to a solution, and putting that together from an academic portfolio accessible from all the colleges at the undergraduate level, graduate programs perhaps, and research that is really at the interface of all of those. Great, exciting conversations are going on. Additional symposiums and workshops will be organized. Keep an eye out for it. We'll probably go officially public. This is a semi-official one because I didn't know I was speaking until I came in here 5 minutes ago. Probably in the next month or so. And keep an eye out for it. So thanks for giving me a chance to describe it. And it's really a university-wide effort. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Let's actually move, thanks, Lindsay. Let's move directly into the panel. Thanks, Ken, for that introduction. Thank you all again for being here. I'm going to launch directly into the conversation today. And as I said, the conversation is largely is about once this current crisis about wherever the oil price is today is gone, where do we see ourselves being? What are the likely destinations that this will take us to? What are the likely paths to those destinations? Which of those are desirable? One last thing, I'm getting a signal from the back. If the panel can also speak louder, I will also try to do that. These mics are for recording and do not necessarily work at the back of the room. So let me start with Cutler Cleveland with that question. But as I said, also maybe if you can start with telling us about something about the other initiatives also going at the university, particularly within the university and its space.
Sure. Thanks, Adil. There's also a significant initiative underway by the university to look at its own internal use of energy and materials in a substantive way, which it's never really done. For those of you who've been around a long time, know. President Brown, in his matriculation speech, announced the formation of a committee on sustainability, which will be co-chaired by myself and Gary Nixa, Vice President of Business Operations. It's going to have a number of committees working on energy and water and public communications. He's given us a fairly significant amount of money to get started. It'll have students, faculty, staff, and you'll be hearing more about that in the coming weeks. But it's quite an exciting opportunity to get our hands around the $2 billion gorilla that is the university from an environmental perspective. So thanks for having me. Nice to be here. Excuse me. I'd like to just talk a little bit about the big picture. I think my colleagues will be talking about some particular perspectives and technologies. But I think to think about where we can and should go in the future, we have to realize where we've come. And we're in the beginning of an energy transition away from an oil and eventually fossil fuel-based system to something else. And it's important to realize what's different about this transition relative to earlier ones and what's the same. What's the same, we can say for sure, is that this energy transition will have profound economic, social, and environmental consequences. All the major hinge points in the evolution of culture have been energy thresholds, whether it's the adoption of fire or the shift from renewable energy to fossil fuels that occurred in the 19th century. This fundamentally altered population growth, geopolitics, economic growth, standards of living, human health, geopolitics, and so on. And we can be rest assured that whatever happens in the next 50 to 100 years will also have profound economic and social implications. What's different? I think there are a number of things that are different. One is the scale of the transition. The last big transition started in the 1850s, the Industrial Revolution, when we shifted from wood and animal power to inanimate energy sources, machines and fossil fuels. At about 1890, renewable energy and fossil fuel energies crossed paths in terms of the amount, when they supplied about equal amounts to humanity. At that time, they both generated about 0.7 terawatts of energy. Terawatt is 10 to the 12th watts. So if we look at the transition now, if we think in the coming decades wanting to replace even half of our fossil fuel use with renewables, we need to come up with 6 terawatts of energy from renewables. That is a staggering amount of energy. I don't think people quite realize when they think about building more wind turbines and their various pet energy sources, just how much energy we have to come up with just to replace half of our fossil fuel use. Which to me suggests that all energy sources have to be on the board to at least think about and talk about. Another important difference is that the energy market today is a global market. Commercial energy is traded in a global market. Supply and demand for energy is critically important. Oil prices, which are determined by both short and long run supply and demand considerations, also by speculation and so on and so forth, are really important. Part of the increase in energy prices we've seen recently is due to, and Robert Kaufman can speak to this in more detail, is a fundamental realization that there's no more surplus capacity left in the world oil market. OPEC can't just open the floodgates anytime they want and meet increases in demand. So we're kind of up against it on the supply side. If oil production peaks next week or 2 years from now or 10 or 15 years from now, in the long run, it's not going to make that much difference. And the other issue is just this enormous appetite for energy. China, India, the large developing nations who are rapidly increasing their needs for energy. So we have to supply all this new additional energy, plus feed the appetites of the already industrialized nations. Another important difference is that the environmental frontier is closed on the planet. It wasn't true in the past. You know, climate in particular, that may drive the carbon issue may trump all other considerations, economic, geopolitical, and others in the long run. And another unique aspect is the geopolitical aspect of the world energy market and the important and growing sources of conflicts surrounding energy. There's always been conflict over energy, but when human society was small and more regional, it wasn't that big of an issue. But now we have oil in the Middle East. More concerning to me is the nationalization of key energy industries. Putin's control now of the Russian oil industry, Chavez in Venezuela, what happens in the Central Asia as more energy is developed there with a lot of regimes with various degrees of agendas, raises a specter of a lot of potential conflict over energy in many different parts of the world. So what can we do, should we do? There's a huge list of things that we should be doing. I'll just hit on a couple of points. One is that I think we have to realize that this transition, unlike the last one, has to be engineered. The last energy transition took place largely because fossil fuels offered an overwhelming economic and technological advantage over their substitutes. It was in part scarcity driven due to the shortage of wood flow and yield, but it was really something that happened kind of on its own through a series of fortuitous inventions and discoveries. This transition has to be engineered because the time we have to deal with climate issues, the need to deal with global geopolitics and confrontation, the limits of the market to steer us in the right direction quickly enough all suggest that there needs to be strong policy intervention at a variety of scales. Secondly, I would say that we need, what we're doing now in terms of research and development, particularly in the U.S., but even around the world, is paltry compared to what needs to be done. And I would suggest that all non-carbon sources, including nuclear power, including carbon sequestration and storage, and all the other renewables that we know, need much more aggressive development. We need to know whether we can sequester carbon in an economical and technologically efficient way. And is it going to raise the cost of electricity 3 cents or 20 cents? We have no idea. If we can divorce the carbon content from fossil fuels in an economical way, that changes the energy game. Nuclear power is obviously very dicey from a political perspective, but it's the most well-developed non-carbon source we have. We can't ignore it. And we're not building any plants. I think we should be building some of these new generation of plants to see what they're going to cost. We have no idea what they're going to cost because no one's building them. Finally, I think that the market needs to be steered towards reducing consumption. We like to focus on the supply side in the U.S. The demand side is the third rail of U.S. energy politics since Jimmy Carter's ill-fated fireside chats. On the demand side, we need a tax on energy to keep energy prices high and permanently high in the perceptions of people and technology producers. We need changes in land use. The way we think about land use, people are going to have to move closer to where they work. It's inevitable as we move to low power density sources like wind and biomass. And so those are two things I think where public intervention is important. And finally, I think that there needs to be a way that amongst ourselves and also with our government, we start a more realistic education, conversation about energy and the environment, not the least of which is that this may not be a painless transition. There's no guarantee that the living standards of the West are going to continue to grow while we raise the living standards of the poor and everyone's going to live happily ever after. We, in fact, may have to become poorer or at least less rich, not as quickly as we would like to, because there's no guarantee that the next generation of technologies is going to do the same amazing things that fossil fuels did. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Cutler, for letting us know we'll all have to get poorer. on that happy note. But no, thank you for setting this up, I think, in many of its dimensions, and setting it up for the next two speakers extremely well, who I hope will be similarly brief and poignant in their remarks, especially I think what you said about nuclear will be picked up by Moeed. But our next speaker, Uday Pal, I wanted to go to, and I think one of the things that you mentioned is that it's not as if one will move from oil to something else. But this transition, as also other transitions in the past, will move from one dominant energy to a set of energies and a mix of energies. And maybe that's a good place for Uday to pick up. Uday.
Okay. Adil, first of all, let me thank you for having me here. I'm delighted to be here and be able to participate in this topic of discussion, which is very near and dear to my heart, and I'm sure it's to yours as well. So Adil had laid out some ground rules for me, and that was I shouldn't have any slides, which is in order to save you, I guess, and then I should not be talking about my research, and I should not prepare for this discussion. I should just come here and have fun. All right. So I think that's a great way. That's a great way to start. And so before I begin, I would like to just frame the problem, and I will describe how I see that problem shaping in the future. And then together with you, we'll seek at mitigating solutions and figure out how we can deal with the problem in terms of its solutions. So let me start by asking how many of you feel that we will be consuming less energy next year compared to this year? None, right? And it has been historically true, and it is going to be so unless we have some tragedies. And the reason is that the population growth, as Cutler had mentioned, and the economic growth has really outpaced our ability to technologically innovate and our willingness to conserve energy. The population growth, I'm sure all of you can figure out. Economic growth, GDP per capita has been increasing. And the technological innovation, which can be measured as energy consumed per unit GDP, that has actually been decreasing. But that decrease is not as fast as the population growth and economic growth. So in effect, our energy consumption has been increasing in totality. So if we did not have the technological innovation factor, then in the next, say, 40 to 50 years, our energy use would have tripled. Now, because of this technological innovation, the estimated energy use is expected to double. From right now, if I use the same units as Cutler is using, 13 terawatts, to it might go up to 26 to 28 terawatts. So what is the consequence of this increased energy consumption? So right now we are consuming, or 85% of our energy needs is coming from fossil fuel, with roughly equal amounts coming from coal, oil, and natural gas. So when we use fossil fuel for energy conversion, we are generating CO2. And this CO2, unlike ozone, has a long life, a long life. So if we continue to consume energy with fossil fuel, we are going to continue the carbon emission, and the CO2 concentration is going to rise. Now, the technological innovation is actually decreasing the carbon emission per unit energy generated. Okay? Now, even with this technological innovation, if we stay in the same trajectory of technological innovation at the same rate, the CO2 concentration right now is around 350 to 360 parts per million. And in the next 40 to 50 years, it's expected to be around 800 parts per million. And we know the consequences of this in terms of global warming. So really, what do we have to do? It is very simple. We need to move away from this trajectory of technological innovation and come up with a disruptive carbon neutral technology assisted by policy which will promote adoption of clean energy technologies. So how do we do this? Okay. So if we look at the possible solutions that we have, it would be like, I can tell you the ideas that I have. First of all, we really need to start with energy savings. We need to come up with more efficient technologies that will allow us to save energy. For example, if you have better building materials and building codes, we are going to save energy. So every joule of energy that we do not use, we save 4 to 5 joules of energy trying to produce that 1 joule of energy that we use. So saving energy is going to go a long way. We can use fuel cells, which is my area of research, with power generation and cogeneration that will increase the efficiency. We can employ fuel cells in automobile that will also increase efficiency. We should continue to invest in carbon neutral technologies like wind, hydro, geothermal, ocean, tidal. But as Cutler mentioned, the amount of energy that we will need in the next 40 to 50 years, it will just not be possible to have these technologies that I just mentioned to be able to supply that kind of energy demand. Okay? So it will not be possible to supply the energy that we consume today, these carbon neutral technologies. So we need something which is in much grander scale. So what can we do in such grander scale? One would be, for example, I can think of using fossil energy with complete carbon sequestration. When I say complete carbon sequestration, I mean that it should be less than, if the leak rate should be less than 0.05%, which is no small task, right? And also these fossil energies that are the fossil sources that we have, it is abundant, it is cheap, and it is not going to run out anytime soon. Okay? The second source that we have in abundance is plutonium. So one could try to develop a nuclear power industry that runs on plutonium. Again, the scale is so huge that even if the technology were to be feasible, the implementation is no small task. For instance, if you want to substitute or generate 28 terawatts with nuclear power based on plutonium, each power plant is 1 gigawatt, so you're really talking about building 28,000 nuclear power plants. And right now we have only 400 maybe closer to 500 nuclear power plants. Yeah. So the scale is immense, okay? And the same thing goes with the solar energy. We have plentiful of solar energy. In 1 hour, we get enough energy or in 1 hour, we get enough energy that we consume for the entire year. So we need to find a way to capture, convert, store, transport, and use the sun's energy. So in conclusion, I'm going to say that as Nathan Lewis in his plenary talk at MRS had said, that the Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones. So similarly, our age of fossil energy is not going to end because we run out of fossil fuel. And the other thing I want to mention here in support of my research is that if we do not come up with a nano device or a nano widget, or if we do not come up with a cure for cancer or new ways to deliver a drug, our life is not going to get any worse. It may not get any better, it's not going to get any worse. But if we do not find a way to solve our energy crisis, our civilization may be at risk.
Wow, thank you very much. If that's how profound you are without preparation, I wonder what you sound like when you have prepared. We will have to find that out soon too. But thank you. That's again yet another very large and very interesting and powerful way to look at this. I think both of you have pointed out the scale thing. I won't put the question now, but just throw one thought out before I forget it, and maybe we can talk about it in the Q&A. I think we should worry about the scale, but it also seems to me, I wonder how many gas stations we have in the U.S. Cutler, do you have rough magnitude? Hundreds of thousands? But I assume that if 100 years ago someone sat around and said, that's how many gas stations we will need to create an economy around a box that you put gas into, they would have said, well, that's never going to happen, so let's not even go there. So while scale, I think, has to be taken seriously, we also, as a human endeavor, have often built these things one at a time. I'll go directly to Moeed Yusuf, who, as I said, is a fellow here. Is this paper coming out very soon from the Pardee Center. We have a series of working papers called the Pardee Papers, in which that will be published. The first one was just published. It's called The Future of Space Exploration and Human Development. It also talks about energy. And it's actually authored by the former president of India, APJ Abdul Kalam. So you're in good company, but I don't know what you will say as a Pakistani following the Indian president on that.
Let's not go there. No, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity and being part of such a sort of illustrious panel. It's always difficult to speak about a topic which is as enthusiastically charged and sort of ideologically driven at the moment as nuclear energy. And I'll focus on nuclear energy mostly to make a larger point at the end. But let me submit right in the beginning that, to my mind, I think, disagreeing with Professor Cleveland, nuclear energy probably will not be the future that we are looking to. I'll just sort of frame this issue in terms of the cost-benefit equation of nuclear energy as it seems today, to make the argument. But before that, I mean, it's important to look at this energy source not only because it's non-carbon emitting, but also because there is a serious debate now about a nuclear renaissance in the world. We are looking at optimistic projections which talk about a doubling of the capacity from the current level in about 20 years, and then another doubling in the next 15 years, according to nuclear renaissance optimists. The other important thing to note here for nuclear energy is that the projections don't see this as being an equal spread around the world. In fact, there are only 6 countries which are supposed to give you over 2/3 of nuclear energy, and 5 of them come from the Eastern Bloc geographically. China and India, which seem to be part of the future, even though I'm a Pakistani, I have to admit that, South Korea, Japan, and Russia. So apart from the US, the other 5 countries all belong to the Eastern Bloc, and China and India, of course, to the developing world. The argument really, there are 6 determining factors to my mind. The most important one, of course, for any energy source is economic competitiveness. And while Professor Cleveland is correct, I mean, all bets are off in some ways. There hasn't been any new nuclear plant developed in the US for the past 20 years. And we really don't know what the new technologies cost, although there's a lot of speculation. We do have empirical evidence from the East, Japan, South Korea, India to some extent. And also there have been a few detailed studies on what it may cost in the US. And all of them project that at the moment, nuclear energy is decisively more expensive than coal and gas-based fossil fuels. The other aspect here is that nuclear energy's real sort of, the downside is investor uncertainty. And the reason we don't have nuclear plants which have come up, despite the fact that we're talking about a renaissance, is precisely because the real cost of nuclear weapons is upfront capital and construction. And thus, the investors, given the first wave of nuclear industry, which did collapse in the 1980s, history of huge cost overruns, procedural delays, time delays, the investors, despite credits and concessions in the US and India, have not been as forthcoming as was expected. Just to give you an example, India, in its 10 major nuclear reactors, has had cost overruns of over 300%. The 5.5 billion that they estimated went up to about 18 billion at the end of the day. And there is, these may improve over time, but the chicken and egg dilemma really here is that you need investment to actually prove that things have improved. And on the other hand, investors are not going to be forthcoming on affordable terms unless you have empirical evidence on the ground to show that. The other concern about nuclear energy, which is unique to this energy source, is the safety and security concerns. And here on safety, I think the concern is greater than has been talked about. If we recall the 3 Mile Island incident in the US and Chernobyl in the then Soviet Union and now Ukraine, to a large extent brought down the first wave of the nuclear industry by itself. And sort of the safety-related retrofits at that time were between 30 to 100 million for each reactor unit. So we have no empirical evidence to show that that is not going to be the case. The nuclear energy still remains hostage to just one major accident, and that is a problem for the investors. Again, the dilemma here is the investors probably, the high-risk premium only goes down if you have empirical evidence of new technologies bringing down these safety concerns. And that are only possible if you have the empirical evidence. So which one comes first is really the question. In India, China, countries in the developing world, the reason costs are slightly lower, they're still higher than fossil fuels, but lower than the US, are that safety concerns are not being met. Safety is very lax. They dump nuclear waste, in inhabited areas. There is no proper formal mechanism. And all this will really have to change if investment has to go in and the industry has to become sustainable. And the cost factor for doing that is an additional 1 to 1.5 in terms of increase in the cost. And thus, again, this makes nuclear energy even more cost uncompetitive. The other part of that, I think, needs no introduction is the proliferation concern. And there, I think that is the single biggest impediment for nuclear energy in the future. It may not seem the best of things to say that while talking about nuclear energy, that I'm not really an energy expert. I come more on this topic from the proliferation issue and sort of looking at nuclear security concerns, on which I've worked quite a bit with the Pakistani government and otherwise. And there, the fact of the matter is, I think if you talk to quote-unquote insiders on the issue, the sentiment is near fatalistic. The NPT, which is holding together this regime, is all but over if you are not going to allow countries like Iran and North Korea and other NPT signatories civilian nuclear technology. And as we stand today, the concern is very simple. The NPT safeguard regime is not being able to curb countries like Iran, North Korea, Libya, to actually not go nuclear. And on the other hand, the only other option you have is this us versus them dichotomy which the US is creating by saying that we can give this to India, no pun intended here, and not to Iran and other countries. And until you have this dichotomy, you will not have these countries in the southern bloc, and they've made this very clear. Even countries who don't have an interest in nuclear energy at this point have made it clear that they will not actually subscribe to any dichotomy in that sense. 13 Middle Eastern countries are now actively pursuing nuclear power plants, and only 4 of them actually can make a genuine case that they require nuclear energy at this point. So the point I'm trying to make is that proliferation is really an irreconcilable factor, not only for nuclear energy, but for the world in the future. And perhaps that is what will hold nuclear energy back to a large extent. Finally, one positive that is mentioned about nuclear energy quite a bit is energy security. India and China are expected to be importing 70 to 80% of their energy needs in the next 2 decades. And there, clearly, nuclear energy has a plus because you require much less per unit input of uranium to produce nuclear energy. It is in abundance in the world. So on paper, this seems to be a positive. The only problem there is that even the most optimistic estimates show that countries like India and China will have at maximum 15% of their energy needs met by nuclear energy. So you're only looking at partial energy security, if you will. And there, the argument is not that that is not needed or desirable, but the argument is that the cost burden threshold for these countries, the cost at which they will probably decide to move away from nuclear energy and go to another source, is going to be lower than otherwise, simply because of the cost differential involved between fossil fuels and nuclear energy. The broader point here, and I'll end with this, is that I at least foresee a squeeze on nuclear energy, in the sense that fossil fuels are more competitive at this point in time. But by the time, if you will, at some point, have empirical evidence to prove that nuclear energy can be, the costs can be lowered, this, as projections put it, you probably will have renewable energies, a less controversial source, which will become preferable by that time. So, you know, you're looking at nuclear energy trying to catch up with fossil fuels at this point. The carbon, sort of non-carbon emission fact is in its favor. But then again, by the time you do that, if you do, perhaps renewable energies, which are already being preferred by most countries in terms of credits and subsidies, will be the ones that will take over. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Moeed. Thank you for doing what we had hoped you would do, which is bring the political reality of the policy decision making into this. It is quite clear that energy choice is not a politically neutral choice. It is not a simply technological choice, and probably nuclear is the most important area where one can clearly see that nuclear energy decisions need not be primarily energy decisions. And that, I think, in various ways is a challenge that confronts a whole host of energy decisions, probably most in nuclear than others. Let me actually open up to our audience to see if there are questions, but as they come, also encourage our panel to respond to things said by others. Of course, I'm sure Cutler has nothing to add to what Moeed said, but but we would actually encourage an interplay amongst our panelists too. Questions, comments, thoughts? We have Jane there with the mic, who will get the mic to you. So if you could just hold for that. Yes, sir.
This follows up.
Could I ask you to stand up and also say who you are for those who may not know?
John Hart, professor of Christian ethics at the School of Theology, also work on ecological ethics and environmental issues. I was curious about the nuclear power issue. It comes up and is being pushed quite a bit now because of its apparent preference over using carbon. I had a couple of questions which hadn't come up in the panel but might be in the paper. One is the actual mining of the uranium, not only in terms of its potential for contaminating groundwater, which has happened in the past, but also the impacts on workers who are engaged in the whole process of the mining and so forth. Second was there were 2 books that came out. It's just about 30 years ago, I guess, since 3 Mile Island. Barry Commoner wrote one called The Poverty of Power, in which he said it was cheaper to use other sources than nuclear, that he said nuclear was a very expensive way to boil water, was a comment he made in that. The other was, and I think the title was Irrevi. It was a nuclear scientist by name of Goffman, and it's an irreverent use at nuclear power from a person who was on the inside and then was writing against it. And I don't remember all the details. I'm not sure how widely circulated the book was. But I'd be curious, at this time of where people are trying to push more and more nuclear power because of the impacts of carbon, if they would, if there are things that have been raised in those books and perhaps other studies in the past that are not being addressed because of our very current pressing concern about global warming and the impacts of carbon-generated electricity.
Cutler, you want to go first, and then maybe we can ask Moeed?
Sure. Well, my students would be shocked to think that I've been painted as a nuclear proponent, because I'm not. And my comment was in the section of what I think we should be investing public money in. And I do think we don't know what it will cost, and I think we need to find out. I'm not predicting that the public opposition and the investor uncertainty will probably rule the day with nuclear power. It may well remain a niche role, but I think that we have to find out. The cost issue is a tricky one. We don't know what it costs. We don't know what wind costs. We don't know what oil costs. We don't know what any energy source costs. We know what the operating and levelized costs are. We know what it costs to build and operate and maintain these plants over their time. And if you look at the levelized costs, which includes all the capital costs and the decommissioning costs, all done in net present value, nuclear, pulverized coal, gas combined cycle, and wind are all in the same range in the U.S. About in the same range. Nuclear is a little more expensive, but they're all subsidized. All energy sources are subsidized. No one would be willing building almost any wind power any in the world, including Denmark and Spain and all the big wind folks, without government subsidies. Wouldn't be happening. Nuclear has huge subsidies associated with it. The government enriches their fuel, for God's sakes. And we pay their insurance bill. And there wouldn't be, all the nuclear power plants would shut down tomorrow if we took away their insurance indemnification. So they all have externalities, right? CO2, worker health, and mining, uranium and coal, photovoltaics. So when you try to add up all these subsidies and externalities, I don't know. So it's very difficult to say that we know that one energy source is cheaper than another. I think that the proper role for an aggressive research and development program is to do the investigations and build these plants and see what they're going to cost, and try and get and be honest about the fact that every source is subsidized and they all have externalities, and we need to try to get a handle on what those are so we can make, at least on the economic grounds, come to some sense of what the playing field actually looks like.
Okay. Yeah, can I add to that? Like if you look at the cost of the energy that we get from coal, nuclear, and solar, the published values are like for the energy that is available from coal comes at 1 to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. With nuclear, it is stated to be between 6 to 7.
But that's operating costs. That's not levelized
No,
costs.
this is amortized.
No, it's not levelized costs.
1 cent is the marginal cost of adding more coal to the
Yeah, but that's not
with
annualized
4 to 5
cost.
cents, it's amortized over 40 years. I mean, that's what I've read. And for solar, it is 25 to 30 cents a kilowatt hour. So it is true that right now, the nuclear power, if you ask the CEOs, in my opinion, is more expensive. I agree, is more expensive than coal. But if you have carbon tax and you have carbon sequestration added to it, the game plan may change.
Moeed, if you can take that, but also be cognizant of the question, also add that. But I guess part of the point being made here is that it is somewhat unfair to look only at the net at the current cost, because current cost for other things has all sorts of hidden line items, and if you made those explicit, it might be different.
I mean, let me say this: if the political sensitivities were not part of the nuclear equation, you would have had the kind of investment we need to actually test it out. And that's precisely the point. That I agree that we don't exactly know, although I think the stats that you're quoting are correct. The fact is there's an added disadvantage, clear disadvantage for nuclear energy, because of which it may not get the same treatment that others do. And I think that has to be part of the calculus. You mentioned mining, and the problem with a lot of mining, as far as I understand, is that the developing countries where mining is taking place, a lot of their efforts, the safety concerns are not met according to whatever benchmarks are set, which are not universal, of course. And you don't get a lot of transparency on how these things develop. So I don't think there's been enough attention paid to the issues, human and environmental, surrounding mining as there should be. Now, I've also made the point, and I think this is briefly touched upon in the paper, that as the Renaissance dream is met, if it is, you will have more and more advocacy groups, you will have more and more public interest litigation, which will start bringing these things out. And thus, that is an additional cost factor in nuclear energy if you have to make it sustainable over the years. So I think, to me, that goes in the cost side of the equation, again, if that does happen.
Let's take other questions right here. Before you ask your question, Nilan, I did want to also add, and this may or may not come in the question, but generally to the mix of the discussion, that we should also be looking at what this means for different types of countries. I think some of you have started mentioning that. As Uday pointed out, our energy use is going to grow, but it's going to grow much more for a particular type of countries, developing countries, and the choices again of energy, both technologically and politically, that they can viably make might be quite different from the one that more industrialized countries. Didn't want me to preempt your question, but wanted to throw that in.
I'm not sure if I'm going to address that. I'm Nalin Kulatilaka. I'm a financial economist from the School of Management. I think the panelists kind of alluded to this, and Cutler probably framed this best at the beginning. As you mentioned, when you look back at where we got to the fossil fuel-based economy, we came from one where we were using different types of fuels that were kind of distributed capture, and there are different solutions based on the locational preferences. But from that time, as we got into a fossil fuels-based economy, we've kind of invested our capital very broadly. The gas station example you mentioned, the cars, the road systems, but more than that, our behavior and our institutions have all been built kind of more centralized, more standardized around this. And as we look forward, and this is where the people I talk to, which is the investment community, as you look forward, you see us kind of reversing that, going back to multiple solutions that are more locality-based. The right solution for one country or one locality, one geography, might be based on the comparative advantage that location has, whether it's the source of fuel or the infrastructure they already have. So the switching away from a highly networked system that's built around this might be much harder. So what I wanted to ask the panelists was, how do you see as you look into the future that it won't be a single type of fuel that will be the silver bullet to this, but rather a portfolio of stuff that would be more suited to individual locations?
Great question. Is the future portfolio of energy more diverse than it currently is?
Well, it has to be, physically. I mean, you're talking about 13 terawatts of energy that we use. If you look at all the renewable energy flows on the planet, the only thing that comes close to that is direct solar energy, and that's all the energy the entire Earth as a sphere intercepts. Geothermal energy, wave energy, forget it. I mean, there'll be niche applications. I mean, the entire heat flow from the Earth's crust is only on the order of 10 to the 12th watts, and that's the total flow. And of course, we need it in much more concentrated spots to use it. So I think by definition, we're going to have to be using lots of different forms of energy. And I think therefore, by definition, you're exactly right. There's going to be much more localized decision-making happening on how to match those to local needs. And we're not built to do that right now. So in one of the ways that when I mentioned in terms of things that we could do publicly is to think about land use. We have to... The density, the power density of renewable energy sources, the amount of energy they generate per unit land area for solar and wind and so on are orders of magnitude less than a coal mine or an oil well. And yet we've developed ways of living, skyscrapers, shopping malls, that are close to, in terms of power energy consumption, close to those power densities. And so trying to run a society like that on biomass or solar, I don't think it can be done physically. So we need to start thinking about what it means to rearranging the spatial agglomeration of people and economic and leisure activities built around these more localized sources.
Ashley Stevens in the Office of Technology Development and the School of Management. How do we go about, I mean, you've basically, all three of you have laid out a very unpleasant array of choices that we have to make. And how do democracies take unpleasant choices? I think back to 1982, when the price of energy hit its peak in inflation-adjusted terms that we only just passed. There was a proposal for a serious gas tax that would have kept the price of gas high, that, had it been implemented, would have reshaped, I think, the last 25 years. It would have driven smaller cars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It got voted down politically. In the current election, we saw both candidates, or two of the three candidates who were in play over the summer, advocating the abolition of or the suspension of the gas tax, not its augmentation. So clearly we don't like these choices. How are we going to go about making them?
Yeah, that's a great question for anyone. How do democracies take unpleasant choices? Because I think all of you have said that part of it in energy will be. I think we learned part of the answer last weekend with the Lehman Brothers thing. They postponed them until the system breaks down. And then you have no choice but to take the... Anyone wants to take that? How will the transition happen politically, even in the US?
As long as you have fossil energy sources, it really doesn't matter, right? Because the day you run out of oil, you are going to be easily able to convert coal to oil. And that can be done just like that. So as long as we have fossil energy sources, we can have the energy economy running. And we do have abundant, cheap sources of fossil energy. So either we come with carbon sequestration or we get out completely out of the fossil energy business. And that's the only way we can probably...
Can I push on Ashley's question in some ways for all three of you? Do you think it is more likely that the trigger is going to be climate related? Or is the trigger likely to be cost of petroleum related? Now, we've talked about carbon a long time. We haven't really seen much action because of it. We've seen more talk, so maybe it needs to boil over. On the other hand, $150 a barrel oil does actually start making people think differently. Which do you think is going to be a more likely trigger? $200 a barrel oil or more about carbon?
I mean, that was essentially the point I was trying to make. So in my opinion, if the price, if oil peaks, then we have other fossil energy sources to substitute for that. We can liquefy, we can start, like right now at BP, it has huge amounts of research funding on changing the natural gas to liquid fuel. And the same thing like the Germans during the World War, when they had an oil embargo, they ran their war machines by liquefying coal. So really the price of oil, we may find other solutions to that.
I think in answer to the question, but both years about what it's going to take, and unfortunately it may take a perfect storm of some events to catalyze opinion. It may take an exceptionally hot summer, like '87, when 20% of the corn crop died and people were dying, and elderly people died in scores across the country. In the same year that a good chunk of the West Antarctic ice sheet breaks off, and there's this big conflict in the Middle East where lots of people die.
You know how depressing that is.
Well,
you say that's what
you've I think correctly assessed historically. I think it is beginning to change. Historically, this third rail of U.S. energy policy, which is the demand side. It's easy to talk about building more power plants, pipelines, and whatever you want, but talking about using energy differently, no president has found a way to engage the American people constructively in that. And so although I think that's starting to change, and there is you said not a lot is happening on carbon, and you're right, at the national, but at the U.S. there's a lot of things happening locally. Cities, mayors, state governments are really starting to get active. So I think there is some, and eventually the people in Washington will have to do something. But it may well take some type of confluence of events like that to really focus the opinion. In '87, that really tough summer, in Jim Hansen's talk from NASA before Congress, really focused people on climate change for the first time. So it may take something like that to really get people to understand, to get them understanding that this is a permanent condition.
Moeed, especially with anything about what does it take in Beijing?
Yeah, I mean, one, I agree. I think it has to be, unfortunately, some shock and awe here, better than the Bush shock and awe in Iraq. But in places like India and China and the developing world, which I'm sort of more informed about, we're very, very far from getting either a government or people who will take carbon more seriously than economics. It's just not viable at this point in time. I don't think there are any talks as these countries democratize from being imperfect to closer to better democracies, India, Pakistan, you have popular mobilization, and it becomes very, very difficult for these democracies actually to pull off something in the name of carbon or environment, which is going to raise the cost of energy by a factor of 2. So I think in that part of the world, it probably is not going to be carbon. You've got to see an artificial increase somehow in the fossil fuels to get this going. And if it is correct that it's easy to actually shift from oil to other fossil fuels, then I'm more pessimistic than most on that.
And it is correct. We are seeing that in Canada with the oil sands. We are seeing that in the Middle East with a lot of talk about gas, sort of turning gas into petrol, liquefied, and all of that. Other questions? At the back, 2 questions. Why don't we take both Robert and the gentleman behind him together? But we can take both. Robert, one of you can go first, and then
Hi, Andy Bruguera, Biomedical Engineering. I have a question related to the demand side and vehicles. How close are we to being able to manufacture lighter vehicles made from carbon fiber? I've heard figures that suggest that these vehicles may cost anywhere from 5 to 20 times as much as conventional steel vehicles.
Can we also take Robert Kaufman's question at the same time, and we can address both?
Yeah, I just had a quick question about what the financial crisis means to energy, in that for a long time we've heard that the market will deal with this problem, and now the market's ability to deal with things that require 2 or 3 years of foresight are shot. So I was wondering how that answer plays. And also now we are now in the process of spending perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars to bail out financial sector. What does that mean vis-a-vis the public's willingness to spend money to bail out not bail out, but replace the energy sector?
Wow, both good questions. Anyone? We're looking at you, Uday.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, the amount of the problem is so difficult that there is no easy solution to it, and there is no easy solution, no single solutions to it. I mean, right now I cannot think of any solution. It's really, I just cannot think of any solution. I mean, I talked about the carbon sequestration, I talked about nuclear, I talked about solar. These do have even if we show that this is technologically feasible, I mean, that we can show maybe, but implementation of this in the time that we have is just enormous. Like like I said, like one average nuclear power plant is like 1 gigawatt, right? So if you want to have 10 terawatts of nuclear power, you're really talking about 10,000 nuclear power plants. And if you have to do this in the next 40, 50 years, you're really talking 1 nuclear power plant every other day, right? And the amount of material, the infrastructure you need is enormous, enormous. So
can I push back? And I know Cutler wants to add, but you really don't have to do it in 20 years, right? You don't have to perfectly replace the current infrastructure with a totally new one.
I'm talking about 40 to 50 years.
So okay. But what I'm saying is, if your own and everyone's argument that it's going to be a mix, the reason I say that is maybe we get too scared by the enormity. That maybe it doesn't require a total conversion of fossil fuel to non-fossil fuel, but you move from it, 1 step at a time, and maybe 1 power plant every week. And we are seeing that in China and elsewhere, that sort of pace of new power coming up. So am I being sort of facetiously optimistic?
I think we need to save energy. We need to be in the conservation mode. We need to reduce our energy consumption and go to a carbon neutral energy generation scheme. So
I think
both has to come together.
Robert's question about the financing is an interesting one. You know, I never really had worried about coming up with the money to do this, because if you look at, until now maybe, if you look at the amount of money needed just in the next 20 years, where we can kind of see what the current investments are going to look like, short of some major policy intervention, it's going to be in a lot of traditional energy technology. It's on the order of, I think, $30 or $40 trillion of new investment to meet this increase in energy demand, which sounds like a lot, but it really isn't. If you look at the total new investment that's going to happen in the planet over that period, energy is going to be competing for those dollars, but it's not a huge fraction of the total. So why should we believe that energy would have any more difficult in the past of coming up with the needed investment? But on the other hand, Robert, if the new dynamic, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, if the new dynamic is if there's less money available overall to do this, or somehow the competition stiffens in some way that changes the playing field, then in fact there may be a challenge for financing this development. And I think you're absolutely right. We simply, while at a micro level, we want to let the market figure out which light bulb to build and which car kind of gets built, but at a macro level, we can't let the globalization and the global free market set the course, because it's inherently biased towards regional, corporate, short-run interests which do not jive with some of the long-run issues that is in society's best interest. So that's why we need policy, informed policy, which I realize is an oxymoron sometimes, at a variety of levels, including the international level, which we haven't seen, to start steering us in directions that the market may or may not get us to.
I wouldn't comment on this because I don't know too much about the U.S. financial sort of side of it. But just broadly to make a point, I think we're going around this argument. But the best and the worst, perhaps, for once, have to combine for this major change to come. The best in the sense of the economy and the availability of finances over the next 2 to 3 decades, and the worst in terms of unfortunately, some shock, which will get people thinking that it's really time to make that shift. If these two don't combine, I think we're going to be stuck in that path-dependent mode of continuing with what we have.
There was also the other question about these innovation in automobiles. Anyone have any?
I don't know that much about automotive technology. I know that Amory Lovins has been touting his hypercar since God knows when, and it's ridiculously expensive. I think the cost is probably coming down due to advances in materials engineering, but I think we'd be better off investing in the next 2 or 3 generations of really good hybrid cars and perhaps electric vehicle cars, although that's a bit farther off, because those are very close to off-the-shelf technology where we could really ramp up fuel efficiency in a major way if we can get Congress to do something about fuel efficiency standards.
Okay. Pablo?
Thank you. I have a question about
can you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Pablo Suarez. I'm with BU, Pardee, and Department of Geography and Environment, as well as humanitarian organizations, Red Cross, Oxfam. We have been talking a lot about the macro level, the gigawatt levels. What about those who are starving for energy, those who do not have any energy today other than firewood and so on? How do you think that all this talk that we're carrying through about getting away from carbon and so on, play for them, for those who are in the middle of nowhere in Burkina Faso? Do we expect, or is there anything we can do to ensure that the advances that inevitably will happen, especially on the technological side, get to them? Otherwise, we're going to have this rapid growth of energy among those who are not starving for energy. They just want more. I'm wondering, how can we get energy to those who don't have almost any now?
If I can also add to that, which I think is a very good point, while a lot of the world is using too much energy, the 4 of us, There is. I drive a Prius. But there is a lot of world which is actually energy poor, where not only will they, but they should be using more energy. And the choices they make are not insignificant, because each one of them uses very little energy, but there are a lot of them and it multiplies. What are future paths that you see for them that are more desirable and practical than others?
I mean, if you're using a couple of candles to light your room, there is no way you can decrease the amount of energy that you're consuming. You have to increase the energy consumption. So those parts of the world, their energy consumption is going to increase. I mean, we in the US are consuming on an average close to maybe 10 kilowatts a person. And people in the poor countries are probably consuming less than a fraction of a kilowatt. So there is a tremendous difference. So the consumption from our end has to really come down. And if I really think in an equitable fashion, the energy consumption of the areas that you are referring to, that has to go up. There's no other way.
Anyone else?
The intra-global South country dimension. There's one thing about, a country getting more energy. But within, let's say, a country like India, I think that's a conscious policy decision we're talking about. Because economics is never going to drive getting energy to a remote village in India. Because even if India gets more energy, it's when you look at literature, when you talk about these issues, it's really about economic development. You're really looking at mega cities and people there who are getting this. There's very little talk about, in this kind of literature, in the energy expansion and the future scenario literature, on how these remote areas will be getting electricity. I think that's a conscious policy choice apart from this, which these countries will have to make. Otherwise, you can have as much energy and use as much as you want where industries are and where factories are, and you'll never get it to those people.
Let me as we come towards close, I'm sure there are other questions, but as we come to the close, I wanted to ask one last question to maybe all three of you. The challenge you've set up is a really huge one, and it's a sobering one in all of its respects. So, but part of what one is hearing is that the solution will have to have massive demand side implications in what we use. The solution will have to have massive supply side implications, both in the quantity, the 13 terawatt things, but also in the quality, the carbon quality, and so on and so forth. The question really is, are we as a species up to the task? My own sense has been we have the knowledge, but do we have the wisdom to make the type of transitions that all three of you are talking about happen? Optimistic, otherwise. Professor Cleveland.
Oh, I think it's going to happen. I tend to be a little bit more. I mean, the transition will force itself either through manifestations in climate or through scarcities in non-renewable fuels. I tend to think we have an enormous store of fossil fuel left on the planet, a lot. Peak oil aside, in most of it, 90% of the remaining reduced carbon in the Earth's crust is coal, the most carbon-intensive fossil fuel left. I think we're going to burn a lot of fossil fuels, and I think the world is going to get warmer, and we're going to see the consequences of that, and I think that the world is going to become more unstable as we start to see struggles over these remaining stores of fossil fuels before it becomes more stable, unless there is a concerted effort within both the developed and the developing worlds, who need to do different things, to engineer a different scenario. Because if we let the business as usual scenario plays out, I think that's what we're going to see.
Uday?
Yeah, I mean, I agree entirely with Cutler, of course, out here, because there is no other way to deal with this problem. I mean, with technological innovation, the carbon emission per unit energy is coming down, but we really need to find a disruptive technology that's going to allow us to generate energy, enormous amounts of energy in a carbon neutral fashion. And we need to increase our efficiency and decrease the energy consumption. So these are the two different routes that should merge in order for us to come out of this problem that we have created for ourselves.
Wait.
Well, they say about people who study nuclear proliferation that they are the most pessimistic bunch for for a group of people who've been somewhat successful in what they've been trying to do, that is to curb proliferation. So going with that pessimism, I think I agree. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But since the Pardee Center's projection period is 200 years, I think before that's up, we'll probably have a change.
I have to say one other thing. There are examples in humanity where we've done these things. The eradication of smallpox, the Green Revolution, where we said, we're going to do this. And we being a collective, enough people in society and political leaders who said, we're going to do this. We're going to eradicate this disease. We're going to purposely produce plants that can grow usually greater amounts of food per unit land area, and we did it. So it can be done. And the problem is that in previous energy transitions, it was all kind of, it wasn't planned. And so I was trying to end on a more optimistic.
I am very glad you did that for all our collective health, because I really do think I don't think the most depressing people are the nuclear proliferation one. It's the environment one. We all wear dark shirts. Sorry, Uday. But which is another group that's actually been quite successful. I would say that in fact the environmental group has actually been more successful than it ever thought it could be. The problem just keeps growing. Yeah. and so I hope, hopefully in November, we'll also ask our visitor from BP whether this transition in the thinking of the large companies is in fact real, and how real that is. But anyhow, I really wanted to thank our panel for really a wonderful. Thank you. And as a little token of our appreciation, we have a little gift that hopefully you'll remember for each one of you, the Pardee Center by. But really a thoughtful conversation. I think the conversation reminds us this is a conversation that needs to be continued. We here will be doing it, and I'm sure elsewhere at the university it will be doing it. Thanks again, everyone, for coming.